If I asked you who the biggest threat to Putin is right now, whom would you choose? Military-aged males? Those currently fighting in Ukraine and those who could possibly find themselves there one day? The working class? Those who are avoiding the war but instead are grinding away for their monthly paycheck? Oligarchs? Those at the top of Russia's economic food chain? Or pensioners? Those retired and living on fixed incomes? Military, working class, oligarchs, or pensioners? Take your pick. Well, if you listen to the mass media takes on the situation, you are liable to hear about the horrors of the war, and perhaps default to military-aged males as your answer. And that is a reasonable choice on the surface. After all, they are the ones with the guns, and they are the ones at risk of dying in the war. Yet, perversely, they are one of the two primary beneficiaries of the war at the moment. But that position will not last forever. And when the war eventually ends, they are not going to just go back to their average lives. Rather, they and their working class comrades will be facing a world of economic pain. And that is when those two groups collectively will start to be a threat to the Kremlin. And that is giving Putin a reason not to pull Russia out of the war, regardless of the outcome. Never mind those that Ukraine hopes to implement. So, today, let's talk about all four of these groups individually, before pivoting to the Kremlin's inevitable post-war problems. We should start with who is actually paying the costs of the war right now in Russia, and why it is not the soldiers. Usually, you would start looking at the cemeteries and say that those losing the most are obviously those who are losing their lives. And that is still true, conditional on death. However, for about 2 years now, Russia has been restocking its forces via volunteer contracts, meaning that those who are taking the risk are choosing to do so because of the wage that the Kremlin is offering them. As a result, the only people heading to war right now are those that are happy with the financial packages being offered to them or to their families. And they are making quite a bit, to be sure. Such is the nature when you are risking life and limb. Indeed, it is called a risk premium in labor economics, and you usually see it in less extreme circumstances, like employment on offshore oil rigs. Deployment to Ukraine is just an extreme application of the idea. Of course, there is some variance here. Roll a 5 and die, and you would regret your decision after the fact. Roll a 4 and live some more, though, and you make a killing. The thing is, though, the unlucky ones are not exactly around to raise any complaints afterward. You might have some angry mothers and wives who could cause a stir, but even then, death benefits hedge against exactly that sort of thing. And, to be clear, the general principles of such a system tend to be the best way to build an army. Market wages for the job ensure that only those that want to fight do the fighting. It is one of the main reasons why the United States switched to an all-volunteer force decades ago. The point is that these people are not liable to cause a stir in Moscow at the moment. Not unless there is a return to the September 2022 era involuntary mobilization, or a meta-belief that something like this might happen again, causing this cohort to preemptively rise up against Russia. So when you hear people talking about the divide in recruitment rates creating some sort of regional tensions, say between Siberia and Moscow or St. Petersburg, well, no, that is not quite accurate. Actually, it is very much the opposite. Siberia is doing well precisely because of those contracts. Again, it was different under involuntary mobilization, when the metro elites were skirting their military obligations to the detriment of others. But the Kremlin has moved as far away from that policy as possible, indeed because of the concerns that popped up with it the last time. Now, there are other ways that this group could still present problems. For example, if they suddenly were to stop getting paid, then that breaks the social contract that underlies the volunteer army, and we are back to thinking about a march on Moscow. To wit, There was a whole exchange during Putin's end-of-the-year roundtable, where a questioner pointed out that those involved in the defense of Kursk were not receiving the same benefits as those fighting in Ukraine. Putin said that he was unaware of that, apologized, and promised to fix it immediately. Likewise, if the voluntary soldiers start to see their contracts involuntarily renewed, and there seem to be some cases like that, then we are basically back to where we started. And part of the motivation for Ukraine's Kursk offensive was to draw more groups into the war, specifically the National Guard, who would not be there voluntarily. That is part of the reason why North Korean soldiers have entered the fray there. But the point is that they are not the ones that the Kremlin worries about. For now, anyway. We will get back to them in a minute. Connected to the military group is the satisfaction of basically everyone of working age in the country. Two things are driving this. First, after the Ministry of Defense contracted so many soldiers, newfound competition arose in the labor sector. With risk-acceptant citizens departing for Ukraine, fewer people remain to work regular jobs. Consequently, employers have raised wages to stay competitive. And it gets even better for the workers. Materiel needs are also forcing the Ministry of Defense to pay for tank factories, ammunition factories, and the like to run round the clock. That further increases labor demands within the country, yet further shooting up wages, and also leading to record low unemployment. In turn, this may be the best time to be a member of the working class in the history of the Russian Federation. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, isn't there massive inflation inside of Russia? And isn't that eating into all of those wage gains? Well, yes and yes. All of that is correct. Working class people are disproportionately affected by inflation because almost all of their paychecks is immediately consumed. But here is the thing. Wage growth is outpacing inflation by quite a bit. As such, those individuals are experiencing real wage increases. And indeed, this was a major topic of discussion during that same end-of-the-year roundtable that we discussed a moment ago. Actually, to be clear about the causal direction here, Ministry of Defense contracts pulling people out of traditional production jobs is the entire reason why inflation is happening in Russia in the first place. Less stuff being produced, more money chasing the products. What do you get? Inflation. Put differently, without inflation, the working class would not be experiencing the wage growth that it is. Someone has to be losing in all of this, of course, and we can start with the oligarchs. Now, lines on mapsomaniacs are an enlightened bunch, and based on this super unscientific poll of viewers, I may be preaching to the choir here. But here goes anyway. It would be tempting to look at the Russian economy, note that annual GDP growth has been between 3 and 4% over the last 2 years, and conclude that everything must be going great for everyone. But then you take a closer look at the formula for GDP, realize that government spending is a large percentage of it, and then start to wonder where all of the money is coming from. Indeed, when you are paying market prices to fund your military, someone has to foot the bill for all of it. The oligarchs, as the group that bears the disproportionate burden of the implicit tax base, are the ones to suffer. Or at least some of them anyway. Those that are involved in the military-industrial complex are sitting pretty right now. But the rest of them? Yikes. Part of this has already been borne out. When the Kremlin created the Fortress Russia National Savings Plan a decade ago, the country overpaid taxes for the purposes of creating a budget surplus. Fast forward to today, and Russia is now running massive budget deficits. The solution is a combination of drawing down the Fortress Russia funds and to increase present tax burdens, something that falls disproportionately on the oligarchs. It is difficult to adjust to this mindset, but there are important implications once you do. When we see eye-popping casualty figures like these, it is easy to default to thinking that this is going to result in anger from the potential soldier pool. But because Russia has been operating under volunteer contracts, what this really does is raise wage demands for two reasons. One, Russia will need to keep recruiting. Now, most of the people willing to go to Ukraine have already left. Thus, the supply is constrained, and wages will need to go up accordingly. 2. Expectations about the risk of death or dismemberment increase. As such, that risk premium from earlier will need to increase as well to compensate. All told, this places higher tax burdens on the oligarchs. And, crazy enough, the working class does even better because of the heightened wage competition. Meanwhile, the oligarchs will have been harmed in a couple of more subtle ways. First, the oligarchs disproportionately enjoy imported goods from Western countries. Sanctions obviously limit what is available in that regard. And insofar as Russians can figure out a way to get around those sanctions, the dwindling value of the ruble has put a significant hit on their purchasing power abroad. Second, they have also lost access to their Western markets. For example, a company like Gazprom has far fewer countries to sell to, and thus the price of Russian gas has a discount on it compared to conflict-free gas. Thus, one way to think about the war is as the largest wealth transfer from the oligarchs to the working class in Russia since the rise of the Soviet Union. Now, how much of a threat the class of oligarchs poses to Putin depends on how easily they can coordinate a coup to replace him. And the fact that he has shifted most of the burdens to them indicate that this is no easy task, as a notable political entrepreneur discovered in the summer of 2023. But at least they actually have a grievance right now, as opposed to the working class. The other group worth mentioning are pensioners, basically retired people living on fixed incomes. Inflation is absolutely burning them right now. For example, if your pension was 20,000 rubles per month, and inflation jumps 10%, then suddenly you are not buying as much stuff. That is how we end up with press conference after press conference that somehow manages to shoehorn a mention of egg prices. Now, there is a simple step that the Kremlin can take to mitigate this problem: push up the pension payouts. And indeed, something like that is always in the works. But there is no such thing as a free lunch. Basic tax increases just shift the problem back to the oligarchs. Perhaps a more sensible solution is to raise money through pension taxes on income, which would effectively redistribute some of the windfall profits from the working class to pensioners. In any case, insofar as pensioners are threats to take to the streets, they too present a current threat to the Kremlin. And before you think that sounds crazy, the last time that Moscow was covered in protesters was indeed due to proposed pension cuts, though that also had the support of the working class, who believed that they would eventually suffer from the new policy. However, all of that is prologue for the main topic for today: the political risks that the Kremlin faces after the war ends. And to understand those, what we really need to discuss is what will happen to the Russian economy in short order, following the conclusion of major combat operations. Overnight, the Ministry of Defense contracts will disappear from the labor market. Simultaneously, the factories working around the clock to produce tanks, armored vehicles, and the like will slow to a crawl. To be clear, they will not stop entirely. Russia will still need to play catch-up to restock its empty warehouse spaces, but they will operate at a fraction of current capacity. This will flood the labor market, causing workers' wages to plummet. A dilemma will arise at the Russian central bank. Interest rates sit at 20-something% as a means to curb inflation. People are less inclined to spend when leaving their money in the bank generates a good return. That pulls cash out of the economy and helps to stabilize prices. The major drawback here is that high interest rates discourage investment. Few entrepreneurs want to create new businesses or expand existing ones, when loans will saddle them in extreme debt. As a result, the only economic growth that Russia has experienced over the last 3 years is in the military sector. and only because the Ministry of Defense was throwing so much money that way that it was possible to overcome the high interest rates. In turn, the number of factories that exist to serve the civilian economy is a fraction of what it should be. There has also been a general underinvestment in productive infrastructure, things like trains and shipyards, which weighs down growth rates in less obvious ways. Think about what this means for the post-war economy. Creating slack in the labor market does not fully solve Russia's supply problems. Once wages plunge, those existing factories will find running additional shifts to be more profitable. So production will increase a small amount. More oversized bottle openers for everyone? Whatever that thing is, the owners of those factories will enjoy massive windfall profits. Prices will remain high, but the cost of production will fall off of a cliff thanks to the lower labor costs. A rise in imports will help to some degree, but many countries will be slow to reopen trade with Russia, and the ruble's cratered value will make their prices seem prohibitively high. So, what do you get? A handful of happy oligarchs, and an angry working class that has felt the rug pulled out from under them, now making lower wages, but still facing high prices, and still pity the pensioners for that last reason. Now, this problem will not go away until the Russian central bank cuts interest rates. Doing so will encourage the construction of new factories, which can, in turn, make a real dent in the constrained supply problem. The trade-off there is that inflation will skyrocket in the short term. It will take a while for those factories to come online, and, in the meantime, there is not much incentive to save rubles, all while problems with constrained supply persist. So, more money chasing the same quantity of goods. What do you get? Inflation. And thus there is a recipe for domestic disaster, a group facing significant economic hardship, a large portion of which recently became masters in how to use lethal force, and concentrated in areas that are not traditionally a part of the political elite. That is a lot of tinder capable of creating a much larger fire. Ironic, given that we are mostly talking about Siberia here. Oh, and we should add the Caucasus to the list as well. Anyway, those concerns make convincing Russia to end the war that much more difficult. The Kremlin cannot just leave the conflict, even under a favorable outcome in terms of where the lines on maps fall, and not worry about the consequences. Of course, that is not exactly a good reason to prolong the war either. The more time that Russia spends in Ukraine, the more that the economy is distorted to provide for the war effort, and the more that the conventional economy decays in the absence of long necessary investments. But the trick for the Kremlin is navigating through those problems without losing hold over the government. To be clear, a shock in the balance of power between two political factions does not imply that a civil war will follow. Once coercive power swings in the periphery's favor following Russia's withdrawal from Ukraine, the onus is on the Kremlin to redistribute political benefits in line with that new balance. The costs of conflict to both sides ensure that finding a solution would be mutually preferable to a civil war. However, that does mean that the Russian Federation of the late 2020s will look a lot different than at the start of the decade. It might not reach the levels of reform following Russia's defeat in the Crimean War, which led Tsar Alexander II to abolish serfdom within the empire. But the government will have to do something. What exactly will this chaos consist of? Well, the short-run problem is that the working class will be taking a hit to its income, while simultaneously inflation will spike. Therefore, the solution is economic concessions to that group, effectively government-sponsored handouts. But that comes with two side effects. The straightforward one is that the money must come from somewhere, which means soaking the oligarchs once again, though they may be in a more giving mood with the end of the war bringing them some economic relief. Also, the entire reason that Russia shifted away from mobilization announcements like this one is because the Kremlin believes that there is more political slack within the oligarch class. However, The more pernicious effect is that the purported solution actually exacerbates the original issue to some degree. Remember, inflation is half of the problem facing the working class in the post-war economy. But if you give a bunch of people a ton of free money, what do you think happens next? You guessed it, inflation. So every ruble that you hand out immediately undermines a portion of its own value. Consequently, the government must overshoot its target just to stay level. The governor of the Russian central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, often ranks among the top of her peers across central banks worldwide. She is quietly one of the reasons that the Russian economy has weathered Western sanctions for as long as it has. But it seems that the end of the war will be far from the end of her problems. Meanwhile, the end of the war will be far from the end of lines on maps. But may I suggest a couple of books to tide you over until then? Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.